He arrived at the ranch just before dusk, when the sky was bruised purple and the land seemed to hold its breath. Caleb Hart stood at the edge of the gravel drive with his hands in his coat pockets, listening to the wind slip through dry grass like a whispered warning. The place looked abandoned in the way grief often does, not broken exactly, just waiting. He had won it in a poker game that meant nothing to him now, a careless hand dealt at a table full of strangers, and the weight of that accident pressed against his ribs as he took his first steps forward. The main house sagged slightly, as if tired of standing. A barn leaned toward the horizon, its boards silvered by weather and neglect. Caleb told himself he would walk through once, make a list, then leave before dark. He was good at leaving. Leaving had become his quiet talent after his marriage collapsed and his voice learned the shape of silence. Montana was only a stop, not a home, and he intended to keep it that way. He heard the horse before he saw it, a low breath carried on the cooling air. At the far end of the paddock, where the fence curved toward a stand of cottonwoods, a black stallion stood alone. The animal did not move when Caleb approached, not even when gravel crunched beneath his boots. Its coat absorbed the fading light, turning the horse into a living shadow anchored to the earth. Caleb felt the strange certainty that the stallion had been standing there for a very long time. He paused at the fence, struck by the way the horse's weight seemed balanced inward, as if it were bracing itself against something invisible. There was no rope, no chain, no sign of injury, yet the stallion refused to step away from that patch of worn dirt. The ground beneath its hooves was packed smooth, a small circle of persistence etched into the land. Caleb lifted a hand without thinking, then let it fall. He recognized the posture. He had worn it himself. As twilight deepened, Caleb wandered the perimeter, discovering the soft evidence of another life. A collapsed shed near the trees held a cracked saddle, and a child's riding helmet bleached almost white. Dust coated everything, but the helmet was clean inside, as if someone had once held it close. The stallion shifted when Caleb neared the shed, ears flicking, muscles tightening with a quiet authority that stopped him in his tracks. This was not anger. It was devotion sharpened by loss. The truth came later, from an old neighbor who watched Caleb from her porch and finally crossed the road. She spoke gently, as though sound itself could disturb what lingered there. The ranch had belonged to a man who stopped living after his daughter died in the fall. The horse had been hers. When the trucks came and the house emptied, the stallion stayed. Seasons passed. People gave up trying to move him. Eventually, everyone else left. Night settled fully, and the neighbor returned to her house, leaving Caleb alone with the dark and the horse's steady breathing. He could have locked the gate and driven away, could have sold the land and let time finish its quiet work. Instead, he fetched a bucket of water and set it by the fence, not pushing it closer, not asking anything in return. The stallion did not drink, but it turned its head slightly, acknowledging the offering without surrender. Caleb sat on the ground until the stars emerged, feeling the cold seep through his coat. For the first time in years, he did not reach for distraction or distance. He stayed. When he finally stood, his legs stiff and his chest strangely light, he knew he would be back in the morning. Behind him, the stallion shifted its weight, just enough to loosen the circle in the date, and the sound of that small movement echoed louder than any promise. He did not leave that night. He lit the lantern inside the house and watched its glow push back the dark, room by room, as if reclaiming something forgotten. Sleep came in fragments, broken by memories and the steady knowledge of another heartbeat outside. Near dawn, a storm rolled in without warning, rain striking the roof hard enough to rattle the windows. Caleb woke and ran toward the paddock, fist sharp and sudden, afraid the horse would bolt or break itself against the fence. The stallion stood where it always had, rain streaking its menere, body rigid against the wind. Lightning split the sky, and the thunder that followed shook the ground beneath them both. Without thinking, Caleb stepped into the open, calling nothing, offering no command. He simply moved closer, one careful step at a time, until the fence pressed against his back and the horse's breath clouded the air between them. The stallion trembled, then leaned forward, resting its heavy head against Caleb's chest. The impact stole his breath. He wrapped his arms around the animal's neck, feeling the heat and power held there, feeling grief pulse and loosen. Rain soaked them both, washing dust from the horse's coat and tears from Caleb's face. In that moment, the storm broke something open. The stallion exhaled, a long shuddering sound. and shifted its hooves, finally stepping away from the scarred circle in the date. When the thunder moved east and the rain softened to mist, they stood together in the quiet aftermath. The ground where the stallion had waited for years lay empty behind them, just earth now, unclaimed. Caleb felt the change settle inside him, a slow certainty replacing the ache he had carried for so long. He understood, then, that winning the ranch had never been chance. It had been an invitation, and he had finally answered. The morning light found them still there, changed, and the ranch no longer felt like a prize or a burden, but a beginning. Caleb knew he would stay, not to own the land, but to honor what had refused to leave, and in doing so, he felt his own life finally step forward. The ranch breathed with him, and somewhere in that shared silence, a future took root. It was enough, for now, and it was everything. He closed his eyes, listening to the quiet, and for the first time, he did not feel alone. The choice to stay had saved them both, and the night gently released its hold. Morning waited, patient, bright, and newly possible. He woke before sunrise to the sound of hooves shifting softly outside, a deliberate, thoughtful movement that felt almost respectful. Caleb lay still, staring at the ceiling where old water stain formed shapes he had never noticed before. His chest rose and fell more evenly than it had in years. Something fundamental had changed in the night, and though he could not yet name it, he felt it in the way his body no longer braced for loss. He dressed quietly and stepped onto the porch, the air cool and clean, the world washed new by rain. The stallion stood near the fence, no longer fixed to the scarred circle of earth, but lingering close, as if considering its options for the first time in years. Morning light traced the curve of its neck, revealing scars hidden by shadow before, pale lines earned through fear and endurance. Caleb did not approach right away. He leaned against the porch post, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee, allowing the moment to unfold without interference. Patience, he was learning, could be an act of care. As the sun climbed, Caleb set about simple tasks. He repaired a loose hinge on the barn door, swept leaves from the threshold, and stacked a few usable boards he found near the shed. Each motion grounded him, drawing his attention outward instead of inward. The stallion watched from a distance, ears flicking, eyes alert, but no longer locked in vigilance. There was curiosity there now, tentative and fragile, like the first green shoot after the fire. Near midday, Caleb carried hay toward the paddock and stopped short when the horse stepped close on its own. The distance between them closed slowly, measured in breaths. Caleb lowered the hay and backed away, giving space and offering choice. The stallion hesitated, then dipped its head to eat. Caleb felt a quiet triumph that did not swell or announce itself. It settled instead, warm and steady, the way trust often does. By afternoon, clouds gathered again, though the threat of a storm remained distant. A truck slowed on the road, then stopped. A boy climbed out, lanky and unsure, followed by a man whose posture suggested pain carried for too long. They hovered at the gate, uncertainty written in the way they avoided the horse's gaze. Caleb walked over, not speaking at first, letting silence do its gentle work. The man finally nodded, introducing himself as a veteran who had heard there was a horse that listened. The boy did not speak. His eyes stayed on the stallion, wide and intent. Caleb opened the gate and stepped aside, inviting them in without pressure. The stallion lifted its head, assessing, then returned to grazing, signaling an acceptance that felt owned. The boy moved closer, inch by careful inch, until he stood within reach. His hand trembled as it extended, stopping just short of contact. The stallion did not move away. Caleb watched the boy's shoulders relax when warm breath brushed his knuckles. The man exhaled sharply, emotion breaking through his guarded stillness. No one spoke. Words would have cheapened the moment. Instead, the afternoon passed in shared quiet, punctuated by the rustle of grass and the distant call of birds. When they finally left, the man shook Caleb's hand with a grip that conveyed gratitude too heavy for language. That evening, Caleb sat on the fence as the sky burned gold and red. The stallion approached and stood beside him, close enough that Caleb could feel its heat. He rested a hand against the horse's neck, careful and reverent. The muscle beneath his palm shifted but did not tense. Caleb felt his throat tighten. He thought of all the times he had pulled away from connection, afraid of the cost. Hey, in the open, there was risk, but also release. Days followed with quiet consistency. More people came, drawn by rumor and need. A woman who had lost her husband. A teenager whose anger hid despair. Each arrived carrying weight, and each left a little lighter. The stallion seemed to sense what they required, offering presents without demand. Caleb found himself listening more, fixing less, and learning that healing was not something he dispensed but something he protected. One night, long after the visitors had gone, Caleb walked to the place where the stallion had once stood unmoving. The earth was smooth now, rain and time already softening the mark. He knelt and pressed his hand to the ground, feeling its cool solidity. He understood then that staying had not been about saving something broken, but about refusing to abandon what still mattered. Rising, he turned to see the stallion watching him, eyes bright in the dark. The horse stepped forward, closing the last distance, and rested its forehead against Caleb's. The contact was brief, intentional, and profound. Caleb laughed softly, the sound surprising him with its ease. In that instant, he felt aligned with the life unfolding around him, no longer separate, no longer hiding. The ranch was not healed, not finished, but it was alive again, breathing with shared purpose. As the stars emerged overhead, Caleb knew this was only the beginning. There would be hard days, setbacks, and moments when the weight returned. But there would also be mornings like this, marked by choice and connection. He stayed where he was, leaning into the quiet, allowing hope to root itself deeply. The stallion remained beside him, steady and present. Together, they faced the open land, and for the first time, Caleb felt ready for whatever came next, because he was no longer alone in the waiting. He learned the rhythms of the ranch the way one learns a language spoken softly, by listening more than speaking, by noticing what changed when no one was watching. Mornings arrived with pale light and the scent of hay warming in the sun. Evening settled gently, the sky stretching wide as if it, too, needed room to breathe. Caleb moved through these hours with a steadiness that surprised him. The stallion followed at a distance, not tethered by rope or routine, but by something quieter and far more durable. Word traveled without intention. People came not because there was a sign or a promise, but because someone they trusted had felt something ease here. A mother brought her daughter, who flinched at sudden sounds. An old ranch hand arrived with a limp and a history of nights without sleep. They did not ask for help. They simply stood near the fence, watching the horse, absorbing the calm that seemed to radiate outward like heat from sun-warmed stone. Caleb never positioned himself as an answer. He poured coffee, fixed what was broken, listened when words surfaced, and respected silence when they did not. The stallion, Shadow, as the name eventually settled without ceremony, became the center without trying to be. Children brushed his manet, veterans rested a hand against his flank, and something in their breathing slowed to match his. Caleb watched these moments with a reverence that bordered on disbelief. He had expected responsibility to feel heavy. Instead, it felt like purpose unfolding. The day of the storm returned without warning, harsher than the one that had bound him and Shadow together. The sky darkened early, clouds stacked thick and impatient. Thunder rolled across the plains, deeper and closer this time. A group of visitors lingered in the barn, uncertain whether to leave or stay. Caleb moved among them calmly, his voice low and reassuring. Shadow paced near the paddock gate, energy tight. It was pinned back against the rising wind. When the lightning struck the far fence and sent a crack of fear through the air, a young boy screamed and dropped to the ground, hands clamped over his ears. His father froze, helpless. Without thinking, Caleb opened the gate. Shadow surged forward, then stopped, turning as if waiting for permission. Caleb nodded once. The stallion moved to the boy and lowered himself, body massive and steady, creating a living barrier between the child and the chaos of the sky. The boy's cries softened into sobs. He pressed his face into Shadow's manner, breathing in the familiar scent of horse and earth. The thunder continued, but its power seemed diminished, absorbed by the quiet courage of that moment. Others watched, tears streaking unnoticed down weathered faces. Caleb felt his heart hammer, not with fear, but with awe. This was what staying had made possible. When the storm finally broke and the rain eased into a gentle fall, the boy lifted his head. His voice emerged hoarse and small, but clear enough to carry. He said the horse's name. The sound landed like a miracle, not because it was loud, but because it was true. The barn filled with a collective inhale, as if everyone had been holding their breath for years. Caleb turned away, overwhelmed, his vision blurring as relief and gratitude rushed in together. That night, long after the visitors left, Caleb walked the fence line alone. The ranch hummed softly, alive with a residue of connection. He thought about the man he had been when he first arrived. Closed, cautious, convinced that solitude was safety. He understood now that isolation had never protected him. It had only delayed his return to himself. Shadow appeared beside him, silent as ever, presence solid and grounding. Caleb rested his forehead against the horse's neck, feeling the steady beat beneath skin and muscle. He did not speak. He did not need to. The lesson was already etched into him, as clear as the horizon under clearing sky. Healing was not an event. It was a practice. It was choosing, again and again, to remain open when leaving would be easier. In the weeks that followed, the ranch took on a new shape. Not in buildings or fences, but in intention. People stayed longer. Some returned. A few offered to help, to give back what they had found. Caleb accepted quietly, understanding that this place no longer belonged to him alone. It belonged to everyone who had arrived carrying something heavy and left with their shoulders just a little lighter. On a cool evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the land in amber, Caleb stood with Shadow at the edge of the field. The stallion stepped forward, leading the way, no longer bound to any single spot. Caleb followed, feeling the earth firm beneath his boots, the future open and unwritten. He knew there would be more storms. He also knew they would not face them alone. The light faded, replaced by stars sharp and bright. Caleb smiled, a small, unguarded thing. Staying had not fixed everything. It had done something better. It had made room. And in that space, life had begun to speak again, steady and strong, calling them both forward. Time moved differently after that, no longer marked by what Caleb had lost, but by what quietly arrived. Seasons shifted without ceremony. Snow softened the sharp edges of the land in winter, then retreated, leaving behind the promise of green. The ranch learned new sounds, laughter carried on cold air, boots on wood, and the low murmur of people speaking without urgency. Caleb woke each morning with a sense of arrival instead of escape, as if his life had finally caught up to him. Shadow aged into his role with an ease that felt owned. His movements grew calmer, his presence more deliberate. He seemed to understand that he was no longer guarding a wound, but holding space. Children trusted him instinctively. Veterans stood beside him and slept standing up, their bodies finally allowing rest. Caleb watched these moments from a respectful distance, aware that this kind of healing demanded humility. It was not his to claim. It was his to protect. There were hard days. A young man arrived angry and left unchanged. A woman cried for hours and returned home still broken. Caleb learned not to measure success in visible outcomes. He learned that staying meant accepting uncertainty without withdrawing. On those nights, he walked the perimeter with Shadow, the horse's steady pace anchoring him when doubt crept in. Together, they listened to the land breathe. Years passed, marked not by age, but by depth. The ranch became known without advertisement. A quiet refuge, a place where nothing was promised and much was given. Caleb built little, repaired only what was necessary, and resisted the urge to make the space impressive. He understood now that healing flourished best where ego did not intrude. Shadow remained the heart of it all, his dark form a constant against the changing light. One evening, as the sun fell low and painted the fields in copper and gold, Caleb noticed Shadow lingering near the old paddock. Not the scarred circle, its memory had long since faded, but the edge of it. The horse stood still, it was relaxed, gaze turned toward the horizon. Caleb joined him, sensing the gravity of the moment without understanding why. The air felt full, expectant. A group had come earlier that day, including a boy who walked with braces and spoke little. Caleb watched from the porch as a child approached Shadow with careful determination. Shadow lowered himself, offering balance, patience, and warmth. The boy climbed onto his back with help, trembling not from fear but from disbelief. When Shadow took a step forward, slow and steady, the boy laughed. The sound rang out across the land, pure and unguarded. It stayed with Caleb long after they left. Now, standing beside Shadow in the quiet evening, Caleb felt the accumulation of all those moments settle into him. Not as pride, but as clarity. He understood that his life had not been restored to what it was before. It had been reshaped into something truer. The ache that once defined him had softened into gratitude. He no longer measured himself by absence, but by presence. Shadow shifted, then walked forward, away from Caleb, toward the open field. Caleb hesitated, then followed. Together, they crossed ground that had once felt heavy with memory and found it light beneath their steps. At the far edge, where the land dipped and rose again, Shadow stopped. Caleb placed a hand on his neck, feeling the warmth, the strength, the quiet wisdom of an animal that had waited through loss and found renewal. The sky darkened gently, stars appearing one by one. Caleb closed his eyes and breathed, the simple act feeling like a gift. He thought about how close he had come to leaving, how easy it would have been to walk away and never know what staying could become. The realization did not sting. It grounded him. When he opened his eyes, Shadow was watching him, calm and steady. There was no grand gesture, no final miracle, just a shared understanding that healing was ongoing, imperfect, alive. Caleb smiled, resting his forehead briefly against the horse's. In that quiet contact, he felt whole, not because everything was fixed, but because nothing was being avoided. The ranch settled around them, holding the day gently as it slipped into night. Somewhere, someone would arrive tomorrow carrying something heavy. Caleb would be there. Shadow would be there. And together, they would do what they had learned to do best. Stay. Now, click on the video on the screen to hear a story even more miraculous than this one. You'll cry, and then feel whole again. Click it now. We'll be waiting. Morning arrived quietly, as it always did now, without urgency or demand. The light crept across the ranch in thin gold ribbons, touching the fence posts, warming the barn roof, and slipping gently into the open spaces that once felt hollow. Caleb stood on the porch with a mug cooling in his hands, watching Shadow graze in the near field. The stallion moved freely these days, choosing his own corners of the land, yet never straying far. Freedom, Caleb had learned, did not mean absence. It meant trust. A pickup rolled slowly down the gravel road and stopped at the gate. A woman stepped out, her shoulders tense, eyes scanning the ranch as if expecting to be turned away. Beside her stood a man with graying hair and the posture of someone who had forgotten how to rest. Between them was a girl of about 10, clutching a worn backpack to her chest like armor. Caleb did not wave. He simply opened the gate and waited. They approached hesitantly. The girl's gaze locked onto Shadow immediately, curiosity cutting through fear. The woman spoke in fragments, explaining nothing fully, apologizing too much. Caleb listened without interrupting, nodding when it mattered, letting silence fill the rest. He led them toward the paddock, where Shadow lifted his head and observed the newcomers with calm attention. The girl stepped forward on her own, her parents frozen behind her. Shadow did not move. He breathed. The girl exhaled in response, a sound so small it might have been missed. She reached out, fingers brushing the air near his menere. Shadow leaned slightly into the touch, closing the distance with deliberate care. The girl smiled, tentatively at first, then wider, as if remembering something she had lost. Her parents watched, eyes wet, hands clasped tightly together. Caleb felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not from sadness, but from recognition. This was a moment he had come to understand deeply, the instant when fear loosened its grip just enough to allow possibility. It never looked dramatic. It looked like this, a child's hand steadying, a breath deepening, a horse standing still. The day unfolded gently. The family stayed longer than they planned. They shared a simple lunch at the old table under the cottonwoods. Words came slowly, then more easily. The man spoke of nights without sleep. The woman spoke of exhaustion that no rest could cure. The girl listened, leaning against Shadow's shoulder as if he were a wall built just for her. Caleb said little. He did not need to guide the conversation. The ranch held it. When they finally left, the woman hugged Caleb briefly, fiercely, as if afraid the moment would vanish once she stepped away. He watched their truck disappear down the road, dust rising and settling again. Shadow returned to grazing, unbothered, present. Caleb smiled softly. Another ripple, he thought, another life nudged back toward itself. As the evening settled, Caleb walked the far boundary alone. The land stretched wide, open, no longer intimidating in its vastness. He remembered how small he had felt when he first arrived, how convinced he was that solitude was safer than connection. Now, the openness felt like an invitation rather than a threat. He paused at the highest rise and looked back at the ranch, the barn, the fields, and Shadow's dark shape moving slowly below. He understood then that the true transformation had not been the ranch or the people who passed through it. It had been his own willingness to remain when leaving would have been easier, to witness pain without trying to outrun it, to offer presence instead of solutions. That choice had reshaped him quietly and steadily, the way water reshapes stone. Shadow lifted his head and looked toward Caleb, ears forward, attentive. Caleb raised a hand in acknowledgement, feeling a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the fading sun. He turned back toward the house, already thinking about tomorrow, about repairs, about coffee, about whoever might arrive carrying something heavy. Night came softly, stars blooming across the sky. The ranch settled into its familiar hush, alive with the promise of continuity. Caleb stepped inside, leaving the door open, the lantern glowing against the dark. Outside, Shadow stood watch, not guarding grief anymore, but keeping company with hope. And in that shared stillness, the future did not feel overwhelming. It felt possible. The first snow of the season fell overnight, soft and deliberate, as if the land itself were learning how to move more gently. Caleb woke to a silence so complete it felt sacred. He stood at the window for a long moment, watching flakes drift downward, blurring the familiar shapes of fence and field. The ranch looked smaller under snow, more intimate, like a secret kept between earth and sky. He pulled on his coat and stepped outside, breath blooming white in the cold. Shadow stood near the barn, his dark coat dusted with white, steam rising from his body in slow pulses. He turned when Caleb approached, not startled, not wary, just attentive. Caleb brushed the snow from Shadow's menhair with bare hands, ignoring the sting of cold, feeling the steady life beneath his fingers. Winter had arrived, and with it came the quiet test of whether what they had built could endure stillness as well as motion. By midday, tracks appeared along the road, tires, boots, and hesitation made visible. A van pulled in and stopped, its engine humming uncertainly. A woman stepped out first, her coat too thin for the weather, her eyes alert in the way of someone accustomed to disappointment. Behind her came an older man with trembling hands and a young boy who stared at the ground as if it might open and swallow him. Caleb recognized the posture immediately. He opened the gate without speaking. The boy resisted at first, dragging his feet, shoulders hunched. Snow crunched beneath them, the sound sharp in the quiet. Shadow watched from a distance, ears forward, body relaxed. When the boy finally looked up and saw the horse framed against white, something shifted. His step slowed. His hands unclenched. He whispered something Caleb couldn't hear, a word meant only for himself. Shadow lowered his head, inviting without insistence. They spent the afternoon inside the barn, sheltered from the cold. Breath fogged the air. The older man sat on a hay bale and cried without explanation, his sobs rough and uncontained. No one rushed to stop him. The woman placed a hand on his back, steady and silent. The boy stood beside Shadow, one hand buried in thick winter hair, eyes closed as if memorizing the feeling. Caleb leaned against the doorframe, heart heavy and light all at once. As daylight faded, the woman approached Caleb. Her voice shook as she thanked him, as if gratitude itself were fragile. Caleb shook his head gently. He had learned that word could sometimes distort what mattered most. He walked them back to the gate, snow continuing to fall, and watched as they drove away more slowly than they had arrived. That night, the temperature dropped sharply. Caleb checked the barn twice, ensuring Shadow was warm and that the water hadn't frozen solid. He slept lightly, waking often, listening. In the early hours before dawn, he stepped outside and found Shadow awake, standing near the fence, watching the snow settle. Caleb joined him, the cold biting deep, the sky heavy with stars. He thought about how many lives had brushed against this place now, how many moments had passed through without leaving marks that could be measured. He thought about how close he had come to never knowing any of it. Shadow shifted closer, their shoulders nearly touching. The contact was small, unremarkable, and everything. When the sun finally rose, pale and tentative, it revealed a world remade. The ranch lay quiet beneath its white covering, resilient, waiting. Caleb breathed deeply, feeling the cold fill his lungs, feeling alive in a way he once believed was no longer meant for him. Winter would be long. So would the work. But he knew, with a certainty that no longer wavered, that staying had been the truest decision of his life. Shadow moved forward into the snow, leaving clear tracks behind him. Caleb followed, step for step, their paths aligned, carrying warmth into the cold and meaning into the quiet days ahead. Spring returned slowly, cautious after long winter, as if unsure whether it was welcome. Snow receded in thin, uneven lines, revealing dark soil and the first stubborn blades of grass. Caleb watched the chain from the porch, a familiar ritual now, coffee warming his hands as the land exhaled. Shadow moved across the field with renewed energy, testing the softened ground, stopping often to listen. Renewal, Caleb realized, was never abrupt. It arrived by permission. The ranch no longer felt like a place suspended in recovery. It felt alive. Fences stood straighter. The barn smelled of hay and sunlight instead of damp wood. People arrived with less hesitation, their shoulders not quite as tight as before. Some came back for a second or third time, no longer strangers but threads woven into the quiet fabric of the place. They greeted Shadow like an old friend, and he accepted them with the same steady calm, as if he remembered every hand that had ever touched him with hope. One afternoon, a man arrived alone, older than most, his movements careful and deliberate. He stood at the gate for a long time before stepping through, hat held against his chest. Caleb recognized the look immediately, not fear, but reverence. The man walked straight to Shadow and stopped a few feet away, his breath uneven. He said nothing, simply closed his eyes, and stood there, letting the moment hold him. When he finally spoke, his voice barely carried. He said it was the first time he had felt safe since the war ended. Caleb listened from a distance, the words settling deep. He thought about how safety had once felt impossible to him too, how silence had seemed like shelter. Now he understood the difference between isolation and peace. Peace required witnesses. It required staying long enough to be seen. That evening, after the man left, Caleb found Shadow near the far edge of the field, standing where the land dipped toward the horizon. The horse looked older in the soft light, his movement slower, his presence deeper. Caleb walked to him and rested a hand against his shoulder, feeling the familiar strength beneath. He wondered how many more seasons it would share, how much time remained. The thought did not bring fear. It brought gratitude. A breeze moved through the grass, carrying the scent of earth and new growth. Caleb felt the weight of the years behind him and the openness ahead. He knew the ranch would outlast him, that its work would continue in ways he might never fully see. That knowledge did not diminish his place in it. It grounded him. As the sun sank low, Shadow turned his head and looked at Caleb, dark eyes steady and knowing. Caleb smiled, a quiet, unguarded expression that came easily now. He had not been given a second chance at life. He had been given something better, a reason to remain fully present in the one he had. They stood together as the light faded, man and horse, neither owned nor owning, bound instead by the simple, powerful choice to stay. The land stretched around them, patient and enduring, ready to hold whatever came next. And for the first time in a very long while, Caleb felt no urge to move on. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and damp earth, a promise that summer had finally arrived. Caleb stepped outside, taking a deep breath, feeling the weight of winter and spring lift slowly from his chest. Shadow grazed nearby, hooves crunching softly against the warm ground. The horse's movements were unhurried and deliberate, as if savoring the new season, and Caleb watched, aware of how much he had mirrored that patience in himself. Children arrived first, barefoot and laughing, carrying ribbons and small toys. Their parents trailed behind, cautious but curious, their steps lightened by the energy of anticipation. Caleb opened the gate, and the children rushed past, drawn immediately to Shadow. The horse lowered his head to meet them, nostrils flaring gently, eyes calm and welcoming. One small girl brushed her hand along his mane, giggling as he leaned slightly into her touch. Caleb stood back, allowing the moment to unfold, feeling the pulse of life around him steady and sure. The afternoon was filled with quiet rituals. Caleb guided visitors toward tasks, stacking hay, clearing brush, painting a fence, but allowed them to set their own pace, their own meaning. Shadow roamed among them, presence steady, grounding each hesitant movement with subtle acknowledgement. When a young boy faltered, Shadow shifted closer, shoulder brushing against him, and the boy's tense posture softened immediately. Caleb saw it and felt a warm ache, a mix of pride and humility. It was not about control, he realized, but about trust. Evening fell slowly, painting the sky in amber and violet. The land seemed to exhale as shadows lengthened across fields and fences. Caleb walked along the edge of the paddock, brushing his hand along Shadow's flank, feeling the rhythm of the horse's breath. A visitor's laughter carried faintly from a barn, and he allowed himself a small smile. This place, once empty and silent, now thrummed with life in a way that was both subtle and profound. The sun sank below the horizon, and Caleb and Shadow stood together on the rise, overlooking the land they had nurtured into existence. There were no speeches, no applause, only the quiet certainty that the choices made here, the patience held, and the courage to stay had transformed more than the ranch alone. Shadow shifted, stepping onto fresh earth, leaving footprints beside Caleb's. He followed without hesitation, as they both embraced the unfolding path ahead, fully present in the miracle they had built together. The air had softened into the tender warmth of late afternoon, sunlight spilling across the fields in gold and amber. Caleb leaned against the porch railing, eyes tracing the familiar curve of the land, now alive with subtle motion. Shadow moved nearby, each step measured and deliberate, as if reading the rhythm of the ranch itself. The horse's presence had become both anchor and compass, teaching patience without a word, guiding without direction. Caleb felt a deep resonance within him, the quiet understanding that this place, and its stories, was bigger than any one person. Visitors arrived in trickles now, some returning, others strangers drawn by whispers of hope. A teenager with a trembling voice approached the paddock, hands clenched in the way someone preparing for risk might. Shadow shifted his weight but remained still, ears flicking attentively. The boy knelt in the snow-dusted grass, stretching a hand slowly toward the stallion. Shadow lowered his head, muscles coiling then easing, a living assurance that it was safe to stay. The teen exhaled, a long shuddering sound, as if releasing a burden he hadn't realized he carried for years. Caleb watched quietly, chest tight with emotion. He remembered the first time he had seen Shadow refusing to leave the circle of date, rooted in grief and memory. The years since then had felt long, patient, and necessary. And now, in this simple, unspoken exchange, he saw the culmination of countless choices, to stay, to trust, to witness without interference. Healing, he understood, was never spectacular. It was a sequence of small, deliberate acts of presence, each one a testament to endurance and care. Evening settled, painting the horizon with deep purples and soft pinks. Caleb walked beside Shadow across the paddock, boots crunching over earth softened by spring rain. The boy trailed behind, smiling now, his earlier tension dissolved. They reached the edge of the old circle, the place that had once bound Shadow in silent grief. The stallion stepped into the open, free of past restraint. Caleb felt a swell of quiet triumph, tempered by reverence. This was not ownership, not victory. It was release, mutual and unspoken. At twilight, Caleb stood alone for a moment, hand resting on Shadow's neck, feeling warmth and pulse beneath his fingers. The ranch, now fully alive with laughter, movement, and trust, exhaled around them. He realized that the true miracle had never been winning land or taming a horse. It had been showing up, staying, bearing witness to pain and resilience, allowing it to shape a space where others could discover themselves. Shadow's eyes met his, steady and calm, and in that gaze, Caleb understood the depth of what had been achieved. Night fell, stars emerging one by one across the vast Montana sky. Caleb and Shadow walked slowly back toward the barn, leaving footprints that intertwined like a quiet signature. Inside, lantern light flickered against walls lined with hay, tools, and remnants of hands that had built and healed here before. The ranch was no longer a solitary endeavor. It had become a living testament to patience, empathy, and courage. Caleb felt whole in a way he hadn't known he could. Shadow nuzzled his shoulders softly, and he whispered thanks into the cool night. And in that quiet, enduring bond, the promise of tomorrow awaited, open, uncertain, but filled with the certainty of connection. Caleb finally understood. Staying, witnessing, and offering present had been enough to transform grief into growth, isolation into community, and loss into lasting hope. Now, Click on the video on the screen to hear a story even more miraculous than this one. You'll cry and then feel whole again. Click it now. We'll be waiting.